All right, Chapter 29, Civil Rights, Vietnam, and the Ordeal of Liberalism. So, in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the 1960s, which was an incredibly turbulent time for the United States. Last chapter, we started talking about the early civil rights movement, and that will continue through the 60s. We'll be talking about the counterculture movement, and we'll be talking about Vietnam. There's a lot of stuff going on in the United States, and it's a very unsettled time, especially considering we're just exiting what we call the golden age of Americana. Sort of the heyday of the United States. Now we're moving into maybe some more unsettled waters. So we will talk about the racial crises of the 1960s. We'll talk about the politics of the 1960s. We'll talk about JFK as president, and then, of course, his successor, Lyndon Johnson. And then we'll talk about the growing American involvement in Vietnam. So let's start with the civil rights movement. By far, the biggest crisis in the United States in the 1960s will be civil rights. I mentioned last time the election of 1960 will see JFK elected as president. And at least initially, he does not do a whole lot to further civil rights in the United States. The biggest problem for JFK is that he's a member of the Democratic Party. I don't think that he was a racist at heart, but the issue was that he was a Democrat, and the bastion of Democratic power in the United States was in the South. And of course, the South is still firmly segregated. They are firmly in the era of Jim Crow. And so JFK, in order to keep the support of his fellow Democrats, at least initially, kind of had to step lightly around the issue of civil rights. And so, at least in the early 1960s, the early civil rights movement, a lot of the important things will be handled at the grassroots level. Leadership is not coming from above, it's coming from below. The actual people themselves are fighting for the advancements. So, we already mentioned in the last chapter Martin Luther King Jr.'s group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Then you also have the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that had been around since the 1800s. And then two new groups, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then the Congress of Racial Equality. And those are the four major players during the modern civil rights movement. They organized protests, they organized demonstrations, they organized sit ins. And the big one in the early 60s were what were known as freedom rides. And these were efforts to desegregate bus lines, bus stations, by literally riding the buses, kind of like the Montgomery bus boycott. Um, okay, the first big turning point in the modern civil rights movement comes in 1963 in Alabama. A lot of these actions will sort of revolve around Alabama and Mississippi. It happens in Birmingham. What happens is Martin Luther King Jr. organizes a series of protests. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy was civil disobedience, nonviolence. Even if violence is offered to you, turn the other cheek. So, a series of nonviolent protests. And unfortunately, when these protests occurred, the police were called out and they used pretty brutal tactics to break up these protests. The use of water cannon and water hose to hit students, and this is not getting hit with like a garden hose. This will bruise you. It will cut your skin. It's incredibly painful. They used attack dogs on peaceful protesters. But here's the difference, and here's why it's one of the first major turning points. These sorts of things had happened before. This is certainly not the first time that violence had been used. This was certainly not the first time that demonstrations and protests had been held. The difference was the use of TV, because for really the first time, these images are being beamed into people's homes. And so it's one thing to open up the newspaper the next day and read a news story about a protest that happened. It's one thing even to see a picture in the newspaper of a protest that happened. But these images are being beamed into people's homes. They're seeing these things happen, and it hits them in a different way. And I think it really opened a lot of people's eyes as to what was really going on in the country. it gets even worse when the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, he goes on TV and he says, you know what? I fully support the police actions. They were right to do what they did. And in fact, in part of a publicity stunt, he travels to the University of Alabama. There were black students who were attempting to register for classes at the University of Alabama. And he physically stood in the doorway and said, I refuse to allow any black students to attend this school. And in fact, they had to call out the National Guard to finally allow the students to attend. Medgar Evers was a black civil rights activist. He was murdered. In fact, I think the day after George Wallace stood in the doorway. And so all of these things kind of came together, and they finally convinced JFK that he had to come out and do something. And so he decided to openly support civil right, the civil rights movement. New desegregation legislation was sponsored, and in support of these new laws that were sponsored by JFK, Martin Luther King Jr. organizes his famous March on Washington. 200,000 people marched on Washington, D.C. You see here, this is the National Mall, the area in between the Washington Monument, which you see in the background, and then the Lincoln Memorial, which would be behind them. This is where King gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. And eventually, this new desegregation legislation would win through and actually become law. Next year, 1964, was known as the Freedom Summer, and the decision was made to focus on voting rights. And of course, ever since the end of the Civil War, the 15th Amendment says you cannot deny the right to vote due to race. Well, Southern states in particular had found ways around that amendment, things like poll taxes and literacy tests. So even though technically Black Americans were allowed to vote, they had the right to vote, in reality, they could not. So we will see that the Freedom Summer is going to focus on organizing Black voter participation. And again, it turns violent. Activists are beaten. At least 3 civil rights workers were killed. In 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. organizes a series of marches. The marches were 3 marches from Selma to Montgomery, and again, they were met with violence. In fact, they had to call out the National Guard again to protect them as they made these symbolic marches. And eventually, this will see the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which provides federal protection to anyone, but especially Black citizens attempting to exercise the right to vote. And so we begin to see a shift. There are 2 kinds of segregation that we're looking at. There's de facto segregation and de jure segregation. And I think of it, de jure kind of sounds like jury, like a lawyer or legal. De jure segregation is segregation that's rooted in law. And so there were laws on the books. Remember Plessy v. Ferguson, right? Separate but equal. There were laws on the books which enforced segregation in the United States. That kind of segregation is going away. It's being replaced, however, maybe not replaced, but the segregation that continued was known as de facto segregation. And that is segregation in reality, or segregation in fact. Because even though we were getting rid of the laws, segregation had existed for so long that it was now part of everyday life. It was sort of part of the custom. It was really part of the culture. And I'll give you an example. The school that you attend, the public school, and I'm talking like elementary, high school, the school that you attend is determined by where you live. Well, under segregation, you had the school for white students, and then you had the school for Black students. Well, over time, white families moved to be closer to the school for white students, and Black families moved to be closer to the school for Black students. Well, even after that ended, remember Brown v. Board got rid of separate but equal, said that schools must be integrated. Even after the laws were gone, the same students still attended the same schools because of where they lived. That was just the way it was at that point. It wasn't segregation that was enforced by law. It was segregation because that's just the way that it was. And so we do see efforts to overcome that. So, for example, in that school example, they tried things like busing students. They would physically take some of the Black students, put them on buses, send them over to the white schools, take some of the white students, put them on buses, send them over to the black school. And that was in a way to get around some of this segregation in reality. Another example would be affirmative action. Affirmative action says that all other things being equal, if you have two equally qualified applicants for a job, you should actively seek to hire the minority applicant. Um, and that again, that was a way to get around segregation in reality. Well, as we move into the mid 1960s, we see a shift in thinking. People begin to move away from King's philosophies of nonviolence and civil disobedience. In Los Angeles in 1965, there is a traffic stop. A black motorist was pulled over, and no one is entirely sure what happens. The white officer said that the black motorist was aggressive and attacked them. The onlooking crowd said no, it was the fault of the white police officers. Regardless of what actually happened, the end result was violence broke out, and then it just spread and it snowballed, and it ended up in what's known as the Watts riots. Over 6 days, 34 people would end up losing their lives. Tens of millions of dollars of damage would be caused, and eventually they had to call in the National Guard to stop the violence. And this was not the only riot. Um, Summer of 1966, there were dozens of smaller riots. In 67, there were at least 8 major riots. But it did illustrate that some people were moving away from this idea of turning the other cheek, right? Martin Luther King Jr. said that if you're struck, if you're harmed, you should turn the other cheek. This was different. Some people are turning to the philosophy of black power, which is the exact opposite of racial integration. It's racial distinctiveness. The idea was to instill pride in black people. So we begin to see things like black studies courses in school. We see black literary and artistic movements. We begin to see people following and investigating their African roots. And this it creates a schism. It creates a break in, for example, between the followers of Martin Luther King Jr. And then there's this guy, Malcolm X. He was born Malcolm Little, but he got rid of his last name in a symbolic act because Little was the name of the family that owned his ancestors. And so he called himself Malcolm X. Had a really rough childhood. He was in and out of foster homes. His father died when he was just a small boy. His mother was never in very good health. He got involved in crime early on. He spent some time in prison, and that's where he became involved with the Nation of Islam. He was never the leader of the Nation of Islam, but he was its probably best known spokesperson, and he had a very different philosophy. Now, I think sometimes Malcolm X has a bad reputation. I don't think he was saying be violent just for the sake of violence. But he absolutely did say if violence is offered to you, you have the right to defend yourself. And again, even that is a very different stance than what King was preaching. And so there is a bit of a schism. There is a bit of a break in the civil rights movement. All right, we'll come back to that. Let's talk about politics for just a second. I've already mentioned the election of 1960. Richard Nixon, who was the vice president, the anti-communist hero of the House of Representatives, is going to run against JFK, who's the son of I don't want to say aristocratic, but a very wealthy family. He was sort of guided and prepared for politics since he was a kid, and this was the ultimate realization of when he became president. And the whole Kennedy family, of course, his younger brother, Bobby Kennedy, would serve in his administration. He would go on, he was going to run for president himself. We'll talk about that later. Edward Kennedy, Ted, served in the Senate for decades. So the Kennedys are a major political family in the United States. And he won. And so JFK, when he came into the presidency, it was really interesting because there was such almost a cult around the Kennedy family. And I'm not sure why that is. I don't know if it was because they were a young couple, they had young kids in the White House. People really seemed to like that. I mean, Kennedy, he was charismatic, he was handsome, his wife was beautiful. The White House was nicknamed Camelot. It was sort of this glamorous, glamour had returned to the White House. And a lot of people thought that maybe JFK would serve as sort of a breath of fresh air. He was young, he was vibrant, and a lot of people thought maybe this was turning over a new leaf, or, maybe this was a chance at a new beginning. And so he came into a lot of fanfare. He came into very high hopes, but his record is going to be a little spotty. His domestic program was known as the New Frontier, very ambitious, very liberal. He's not going to be able to pass most of it. The Republican Party controlled Congress, and so he's not going to get a lot of these new laws passed. Um, Foreign relations, again, people were hoping that his liberalism, he would be a fresh new voice in foreign politics. We won't see that actually happens either. There are some things. The big one is the Peace Corps. He helps found the Peace Corps, which exists even still today. It's the idea that young Americans should go out into the world and do things like teach overseas or build homes overseas, or they ought to serve a greater calling overseas. And so he did seek to expand America's influence through peaceful measures. And like I said, he is successful there, but there's also some problems that he has to deal with. For example, the Bay of Pigs. This happens in the early 1960s. What had happened was, remember in the last chapter I mentioned that Fidel Castro had taken over Cuba, and Cuba is now a communist country. Well, when that happened, a lot of Cubans fled Cuba because they were in power under the old government. They knew they would be targeted under the new government. So they fled Cuba to the United States. And the idea was to take those exiled Cubans, train them up, give them weapons, give them supplies, and send them back to Cuba to launch an invasion force. And once they landed and had launched this invasion, they could call the United States for backup, even though we were the ones that really planned it in the first place. They could call on the United States for help, and then the United States would be able to rationalize going into Cuba and getting rid of the Castro administration, because they could say, hey, these freedom fighters called on the United States for help, and we had to respond. So that was the plan. This was all done in secret. The CIA was setting this up. They gathered the Cuban exiles, they trained them, they outfitted them, they made plans to invade. The landing point was known as the Bay of Pigs. That's why it's called the Bay of Pigs. And so the idea was that the Cuban exiles would go, they would land, they would fight their way onto shore, and then they would call for backup from the United States. And that's exactly what happened. They were trained, they were outfitted, they were all gathered up, they were launched on boats, they landed in Cuba, they called for backup, and then nothing. The United States did not answer. They were expecting American troops, or they were expecting, air cover from the Air Force. There was nothing. And without the support of the United States, the invasion, you can't see me, I'm using air quotes, the invasion quickly failed. And it came out that this whole thing was a plan from the United States in the beginning. It's just at the very last moment, they got cold feet. They didn't want to risk a bigger war. And so they decided not to support the revolutionaries. And it's, there's egg on the face of the United States, right? It makes us look really bad that we planned all this thing. We sent these men to their doom, essentially. And it's just really embarrassing for the United States. Also in Cuba, we see the Cuban Missile Crisis. We learn that the Soviet Union is planning on placing missiles in Cuba. This is a big problem for the United States. Remember the theory of mutually assured destruction. If we see them launch their missiles, we have time to launch ours, and therefore both sides will be destroyed. Well, Cuba is just off the coast of Florida. If they put missiles in Cuba, they can launch those missiles, and those missiles will hit before we know that they have been launched. It's so close, there's not enough time for us to launch our missiles in retaliation. And so the idea of mutually assured destruction no longer holds because they could think in theory they could launch their missiles first and not run the risk of being destroyed as well. So we know we can't let them put missiles in Cuba. And so once we learn that's what they're planning on doing, we launch a blockade. We send the American Navy down, we string out our ships, and we say, you can't cross this line. We're not going to allow you to come to Cuba and put your missiles on Cuba. So for about 2 weeks, there was a standoff between the American Navy and the Soviet Navy. And this was really the closest time. This is probably the closest we ever actually get to outright hostility with the Soviet Union. All it would have taken would have been one person to lose their cool, somebody to fire first, an itchy trigger finger, and we could have found ourselves in a shooting war with the Soviet Union. Luckily, the Soviet Union does back down. Cooler heads prevail, and there is no fighting. But it was a very, very tense 2 weeks while that standoff happened. And then we see the Berlin Wall. Remember that Germany has been split into two countries, West Germany and East Germany. But also remember that Berlin as a city is still divided. Well, people in East Germany don't want to live there. They want to get out. And so the easiest way to do that was you go from East Germany into East Berlin. And then from East Berlin, you can walk into West Berlin. You can get on a train, you can get on a plane, and you can get into West Germany. And then from there, out to the rest of the world. Well, there were thousands of people that were leaving East Germany through Berlin to the rest of the world. So they decided to build a wall, a literal wall between East Berlin and West Berlin. It's known, of course, as the Berlin Wall. And this becomes a very visible symbol of the break between the Western world and the Soviet Union. And of course, that Berlin Wall will stand until the 1980s. Well, as you probably know, JFK's administration is going to tragically be cut short. As he's traveling through Dallas, November 22nd, 1963, JFK will be fatally shot. You can see here there was actually a film somebody was recording it as he was driving down the road. And this is taken from the film right before the assassination occurred. We don't, of course, there's lots of conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination. The man, Lee Harvey Oswald, was formally charged with the crime, but he never stood trial because Lee Harvey Oswald would be murdered just a few days later by a restaurant owner. This happened in Dallas. A Dallas restaurant owner by the name of Jack Ruby. And of course, Jack Ruby was arrested, but then he died before he could stand trial. And so, of course, there's lots of questions. Did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone? Was there a greater conspiracy movement? And we don't really know the answers to this. I don't think we'll ever know the answers to this. But the end result was, for sure and certain, JFK died in office. And so his vice president, Lyndon Blaine Johnson, is going to take over as president. And I don't know if I've mentioned this before in one of these lectures, but the office of the vice presidency is kind of weird because no president, I don't think, chooses their vice president thinking, well, if I were to die in office, he's the next best guy for the job and I want him to become president. I don't know that JFK ever looked at LBJ that way. Probably not. They were two very different individuals. Uh, JFK had a refined childhood. He grew up in a wealthy family, went to the finest schools. And like I said, from day one, he was really sort of being groomed for the presidency. He was being trained how to be a politician and how to be the president. LBJ is very different. He was very forceful, sometimes almost a crude type of personality. He was a bully. He was a very forceful president. He very much believed in the idea of the imperial presidency, the active use of power. And it was very much, my way or the highway with LBJ. And I'm not just talking about, he, of course, was a Democrat. I'm not just talking about Republicans, even other members of his political party. You were either with him or you were against him. And so he was a very forceful president. Now, his domestic policy is going to be known as the Great Society. And as he put it, he wanted to declare war on poverty. He wanted to eradicate poverty in the United States. And so, two major pieces of the Great Society that, of course, still exist today were Medicare and Medicaid. And these programs were designed to provide health care to Americans that needed help. Medicare was health care for the elderly, and Medicaid is health care, financial assistance uh, to poor Americans. We also see the passage of the Housing Act of 1961, which created the Department of Housing and Urban Renewal. Its Secretary Robert Weaver will be the first Black cabinet member. This is also the time where the federal government really gets involved in education. For years and years and years, education was handled on the state level, and the federal government really didn't have a role in education. Of course, now we know that is a very different story, and that goes back to the 1960s. And again, all of this was a plan on eradicating poverty in the United States. And of course, that doesn't happen. There are still poor Americans today. But Medicare and Medicaid in particular are today giant parts of the United States. They're very big programs. And along with Social Security, which of course came from FDR and the New Deal, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, those are three major components of the social safety net that's designed to help take care of Americans. Now, during the 60s, we're also going to see a political movement begin, especially among college students, but other people as well. But these people began, they felt that society is heading down the wrong path. And collectively, this political movement is going to be known as the New Left. And what they're asking for, they say, is a participatory democracy. They want more citizen participation. They felt like politics was being run at the top level, that only the elites had a voice. You had to be rich or powerful or connected to have a voice in politics. They wanted a democracy of citizen participation. Well, okay, fine. But as the decade progresses, we're going to see that their aims are going to change a little bit. And they wanted not only political freedom, they wanted all freedoms. They wanted political freedom, commercial freedom. They wanted freedom in education. They wanted everything. And it ends up being a total rejection of authority. This is the beginning of the counterculture movement. These are the hippies of the 60s and 70s. They wanted freedom from what they saw as a bureaucratic state that was oppressing them. Kind of dovetailing with this, that went hand in hand, is the modern feminist movement. And of course, there have been feminist movements throughout American history, going back to the abolition movement, to the suffrage movement with the right to vote in the 19 teens. And then this movement, the modern feminist movement, we see things like The Feminine Mystique is a book by Betty Friedan, which talks about how women are trapped in suburbia. Remember, we talked about the cookie cutter molds that people are expected to fit in, that you're supposed to be a loving housewife and mother and take care of your husband and family. And she says that's people are being trapped and pigeonholed into that. We see women become more involved in politics with the National Organization for Women that sponsors legislation and recommends candidates for office and things like that. All right, let's talk about Vietnam for a minute. First thing I want you to know is that Vietnam is a very gradual process. I don't think any American president ever woke up one morning and said, hey, I want to go to war in Southeast Asia. This is something that happens over the course of years. It affects at least 3 presidential administrations. So this is not a one-time thing that any one person decided to do. So a little bit of background information on Vietnam. Prior to World War II, Vietnam was known as Indochina. It was part of a French colony. Well, during World War II, it was invaded by Imperial Japan, and the Vietnamese people, led by their revolutionary leader, Ho Chi Minh, partnered with France to drive the Japanese out. Well, after World War II ended, they asked for their independence, and frankly, they felt that they had earned it by fighting so valiantly during World War II. And France said no. France said, sorry, you are vital to our economy. We cannot allow you your independence. And so sorry. Well, that started what was known as the First Indochina War, a war between France and the followers of Ho Chi Minh for Vietnam's independence. And this puts America in kind of an awkward position, right? Because on the one hand, France is a major ally of the United States. They going back to the Revolutionary War. France has always been a major ally of the United States. But on the other hand, the Vietnamese people are fighting a war of independence for their freedom that also speaks to the United States because that's how we started, right? And so we're in a bit of an awkward position, but ultimately we do decide to support France. And so we get involved. We do not send troops, but we send supplies and we give money and we give advice. And as time goes on, the war goes badly for France. And in fact, the war ends at the Geneva Conference. The decision is made to split Vietnam into two separate areas. You're going to have North Vietnam. It's kind of like Korea. You've got North Vietnam and South Vietnam, with the idea that eventually they would be rejoined as one country. Well, North Vietnam is going to be led by Ho Chi Minh, who I haven't mentioned. He is a communist. That's another reason that the United States did not want to see him win this war, is because, again, we're against the spread of communism anywhere it occurs. And remember, NSC 68 says that we have to challenge communism anywhere. Vietnam is not important to the United States. They weren't vital to our economy. They're not a major military ally of the United States. I mean, honestly, what happened in Vietnam didn't really impact the United States, except that it potentially could lead to the spread of communism. And so that's another reason why we felt we had to support France. So you'd have North Vietnam, which was communist, and then South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States. And technically, the fighting is over, but the reality was it wasn't. The National Liberation Front, better known as the Viet Cong in the United States, launched guerrilla attacks over the border. And so the war continued, and eventually France said, I'm done. France said, we don't want to fight this war anymore. We've lost too many people. We've spent too much money. France is pulling out. And so now the United States has to make a decision. Will we continue supporting the South Vietnamese against North Vietnam? Or how willing are we to get involved? And so that all happened under JFK. When LBJ became president, he got a bad situation, right? All of that had happened under Kennedy. And so when Johnson became president, he inherited a bad situation. And then he went and made it worse. So, number one, he felt obligated to continue what JFK had started, which made a certain amount of sense, right? The president had started this, and I'm obligated to finish it. He kept JFK's advisors, and so the same people that were telling Kennedy to get more involved are now telling Johnson to get more involved. He had a Congress that let him do pretty much whatever he wanted to do. He actually seemed like a moderate. There were some people who were talking about dropping atomic bombs in Vietnam. And so compared to that, he really did seem like more of a moderate. And again, it's consistent with the policy of containment that we must stop the spread of communism. Well, America involvement is kind of cemented in 1964. LBJ announced that America, so technically we're not at war with North Vietnam. South Vietnam and North Vietnam are fighting, and we are supporting South Vietnam by giving them guns and food and supplies and whatever, but we're not actually at war yet. Well, in 1964, Johnson announced that American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin had been fired upon by the North Vietnamese. Well, of course, that outraged Americans. Johnson goes to Congress, and they basically give him a blank check. They pass what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and they tell the president to take all necessary measures to protect American forces and prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. And that is when we send in troops. In 1965, we send in ground troops to Vietnam. And it does not go well for the United States. This was not a war that we were equipped to win. The war in Vietnam was not World War I or World War II. It's not even the Korean War. These are not, tank battles. Uh, Vietnam does not have military installations and railroads and forts that you can send air power to and bomb. This was a jungle war. And this was not a type of war that America had ever fought before. And this was not a type of war that we were well equipped to win. So we try all these different things. We try a war of attrition. And literally, that just means make it as horrible as possible for the other side and hope they give up. You just got to wear them down. And the more people that die on the other side, the harder it is to continue the war effort, and the more likely it is that they are going to give up. And they don't. If you look at the number of soldiers lost on both sides, there are thousands and thousands of more communist North Vietnamese soldiers that are killed, and yet they refuse to give up. We try bombing campaigns. But like I just said, this is a jungle war. It's not that type of war. You can't bomb strategic locations and hope to win this war. Pacification. The idea was if you could remove the Viet Cong and win the support of the villages left behind, maybe you could win this war. It doesn't work that way. And it's not going well for the United States. We see growing dissent among college students, among people in the left wing. More and more people are saying, you've got pressure from the right saying we need to escalate it even further. We need to send in more troops. We need to become more aggressive. And then you've got people on the left saying we're already doing too much. Too many people are dying. We need to get out of there. And so by 1967, the country is, like I said, it's a very turbulent place to be. There are two major crises. The civil rights movement is still going on, and now we're in the middle of Vietnam. 1968, the North Vietnamese launched what's known as the Tet Offensive. It's the largest counterattack in the war thus far. It's not going well for the United States. This is all being televised. And 1968 is also an election year. The Democratic Party is split. A lot of people wanted Bobby Kennedy, who was the younger brother of JFK, had served in his administration. They wanted Bobby Kennedy to run for president. He was very hesitant to do so. And then it gets even worse. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be assassinated in Memphis. And of course, grief is just going to roll through the country that this beloved civil rights leader was shot and killed. And then 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy is going to be assassinated. He was kind of the front runner to run for the presidency. I think he had finally come around and he was going to run for the presidency. And so this just throws the Democratic Party into a tailspin. Nobody knows what's going on. It's crazy times in the United States. And then there's Nixon. Nixon has decided to run again. He lost against JFK, but now he feels that his time has come. And Nixon is going to appeal to what he called the silent majority. And he says, listen, most people in the United States, they're not protesting against Vietnam. They're not protesting against civil rights. He says most people in the United States, they get up, they go to work, they live their lives, they come home, and they just want peace and stability. And he says, I can give that to you. You know, the saying that the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? He says, yeah, there are lots of people who are being loud and demonstrating, and there are lots of people who want change, but those are the minority. Now, they're a visible minority, they're a vocal minority, but they are a minority of people. He says, I'm going to appeal to the silent majority, the people that just want to get up and live their lives in safety and stability and structure. And that was very appealing to a lot of people. And in fact, as we know, Nixon is going to win the presidency. And so that is the end of chapter 29. And so we will pick up again with chapter 30.